Tsepkaquilam, Natsamat Tetsqualoan, Quamquam Slene. I said my name's Cecilia Point. I'm from the Musqueam First Nation, and I want to welcome you all here to our beautiful territory. Any of the elders in the room, honored guests, those who have traveled far to be here. Before I speak, I usually try to ask my ancestors if they have any messages to send to you today. And of course, they're thinking about our stolen sisters. That's the main message today. It's been a really emotional day. It's been a really busy day. I spent time today with families, survivors, and I heard some great speeches, shameless plug for Feminist Deliver as well. So some of you can migrate over to the east side to check out some of those speakers. They are outstanding. So the other message that's coming through is privilege. And I think that's because of our lack of privilege sometimes. A disturbing image I was just sharing with some of the ladies. I heard Sharon McIver, who is working tirelessly for legal rights for women who lost their status. And she's from the interior of BC. And she said what she keeps in her mind all the time in doing this work is a young woman from their community who was brutally raped and murdered and then dumped in an outhouse. So she always thinks about our women getting thrown in the garbage in the worst way and getting fished out of that horrible outhouse for her family to look after her. So a lot of us going about our daily lives don't think about people who have to live like that. Another great point she made today was often a lot of the women reported that their loved ones weren't looked for because they were considered living a high-risk lifestyle. And she pointed out that just by virtue of being born an Indigenous woman, you're living a high-risk lifestyle. And the majority of our women are killed by white men. And unfortunately, our neighbors to the south are showing us loudly how that can happen. So I need you all to pray that that doesn't keep migrating up here. So other than that, the other message I'm getting is just that this is such a beautiful place to live in. And before contact, it was the most populated place on Turtle Island. So I'm so proud to have you all here, and I want you to always think about grounding yourself, looking at the beautiful mountains and the water. Two very powerful forces surround us, and we're very fortunate to have those. I'm thinking about my grandma, Valentina Cortez, who was half Chilean, half Squamish. Her traditional name was Hualequalat, one who laughs and talks a lot. And she is very strong here today. And she came in a canoe over to Musqueam, to our longhouse, and that's where she married my grandpa Tony. So I'd like you to have those images because we're all so busy driving our kids around, and so many of the women in this room, you need to listen to their schedules. Oh my God. There we are out there in our minivans with all our commitments. But I always remember that I'm descended from Hualequalat. I'm descended from Capilano. I'm descended from Valentina Cortez. And I'm descended from Margaret Mary Clenaghan from Northern Ireland as well. So I'm going to sing our paddle song, which comes from my great uncle Dominic Point. I want you to picture yourselves all coming in on your canoes, and our canoes are going out to greet you, Hosiam. Normally I ask you to stand, but I'm not going to make you do that today. Stewart, who was proudly arrested on Burnaby Mountain.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. Of course, it's always an honor to be to recognize that we are gathered here today on the unceded traditional territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I don't know about you, but I always feel super spoiled when I get to hear songs like that. And thanks very much. Also wanted to thank all the staff. We try to do this at every council meeting to recognize the ancestor territories, but also to thank all the staff, both my staff and my office, the mayor's office, who've done a great job putting this together, but also the great staff at the City of Vancouver who work every day to make this city run. So just again, thanks very much to them. We have a fantastic panel here this evening. We were supposed to have Adina Williams, but she's unable to attend for personal reasons. So Cecilia Point will be joining us on the panel. Thank you very much for that. I know you know a bit about activism, so I think that's perfect fit. Our paths have crossed. So we have some other dignitaries in attendance today. We have Councillor Adrian Carr, who's here. Mayor Marianne Boots of West Vancouver. And who's the head of our school board. I saw Ellen Woodsworth here. Is she here? Oh, there she is. Thank you very much. Christina de Castel, who's the chief librarian. I'm to the librarians because my sister's librarian, so and of course, lots of great folks here to attend, so thanks very much for coming. So thanks everyone for being here tonight at this incredible satellite event entitled Women's Activism Creating Change. And I'm particularly proud to help introduce this event as mayor because our council has recently elected 8 out of 10 councillors are women, which I think is civil service now. We have a lot of women rising to management positions, which is so important. but it's not an accident. It's a product of Vancouver's work over the years toward implementing a women's equity strategy, which is so important. And this 10-year strategy has been strengthened by Council's current decision to develop a comprehensive intersectional strategy with short and long-term goals that are measurable for each department and every strategy across the city. So we've enacted that. We're just not quite sure how we're going to put it in place yet, because apparently this is a fairly new thing. So we're really proud about this and looking forward to challenge other municipalities to do the same. One thing I will say, also I have my Jeanette Ash is here. Dr. Jeanette Ash has done a lot of So I just want to say something before we start the formal event that I have to say, being in Ottawa for 7 years and being a council, it is like night and day. In Ottawa, the committees are mostly white guys like me who sit around and yell at each other. But I have to say, this council has just been great. I mean, what I noticed right from the beginning is an inclination towards consensus. And that, first I was suspicious of it, but then I thought, oh, this is how I like to work too. So I really feel like it's a different kind of journey through the legislative process, through budgeting processes, and not everybody agrees, but it's always respectful, and there's always an attempt to get everybody to agree, rather than to blow everything up. So I really find that's a very pleasant way to work, and I'm really grateful to be part of a council that does that. So, not only do we develop better policy, but it really serves as a strong example to women and girls in our city and beyond. So again, it's one of the perks of the job, I think. So really, we think these strategies that we put in place are critical for those who have been traditionally marginalized in decision making, especially women and people of color. And we think that this intersectional strategy will help us better reflect the community, because politics of presence is essential to good policy making. So we, of course, we heard today about women in power, women activism, but we had a very somber day today with the report of the release of this national report. And I'm disappointed that we didn't acknowledge the key finding of the report, which is didn't acknowledge widely enough of the finding of genocide, which I do think we should. It's hard to say, but we have to say it. And I do feel like as in a leadership position, it's my position that we have to say this when it's uncomfortable, whether it's Gilthuk in Newfoundland, or we have missing bird inquiry, residential schools. This is something that it's something that we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, we did this, and how are we going to get beyond it? How are we going to first digest it, apologize, and then get along with being neighbors to each other once again? And that's really our key challenge here, both in the city and right across the country. So I hope people that take a chance to reflect on this report, to think about what you can do personally to make amends and to try to bring our community together. I'm really excited to hear what the panel has to say today, and to learn about how I can be better as a leader in the city, and how I can try to make other places better too, because this is really, really important work. It's such a thrill to have women deliver and feminists deliver here in our city, and I think it really will make the whole place think about how we can move forward together. So thanks again for having me here tonight. Thank you very much to the panel for coming, and I can't wait to hear what happens. But before we get on with that, we have to announce the host, the evening. So I'd like to introduce the Honorable Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia. That's kind of cool. The chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College, United Kingdom, and has helped sponsor this panel. So I can turn it over to the former Prime Minister. That would be fantastic.
It's an honour to be here, and I have to say, of all the times that I've been introduced in many places around the world, that's kind of cool, has never featured before, so thank you very much for that. I'm delighted to receive that accolade. I am here in my capacity as Chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. I'm joined by the Director of the Institute, Professor Rosie Campbell. And of course, we're in town with, 9,000 of our dearest friends for the Women Deliver conference, and it's just a pleasure to be here. And the theme of that conference is about progress, it's about power, and it's about change. And when we look at our world, you pull back and look at some of the global statistics, it's clear just how much change we need to see. If I invited you to guess what percentage of the parliamentarians around the world are women, or what percentage of senior managers are women, or what percentage of judges are women, you'd be in the right zone if you were looking at far less than 30%. And then when we came to corporate board members, we'd be talking about 15%. When it came to senior IT leaders, we'd be talking about 9%. And yet, if you believe, as I do, that merit is equally distributed between the sexes, there's no reason why in any and all of those walks of life we shouldn't see 50% men and women at leadership level. So what's holding the women back? Well, I think we've all got a different answer to that, depending on the perspective of the lives we've lived. From my perspective, as the first woman to lead Australia, I think there are a series of things that hold women back. We've designed structures historically, including the structures of politics, based on men's lives. They're based on an assumption about how men present, the way in which they model authority, an assumption about how they organise their family lives with a non-working spouse or perhaps a part-time working spouse that makes everything possible for them. And once you break out of that traditional model of male leadership, then the questions come: a ridiculous focus on appearance, what you're wearing, crazy focus on family structures. If you don't have kids and I don't, then people say, how on earth can you understand everyday life if you don't have your own children? If you do have kids, well, heavens, who's looking after them? So get around this business of politics. And now there's very clear psychological research that tells us we tend to correlate likability and leadership for men. So that unconscious bias in the back of our head whispers that a man who is succeeding and leading is probably quite likeable. That unconscious bias in the back of our heads whispers to us that a woman who is succeeding is probably quite unlikable. She's probably quite ruthless, quite hard-boiled. She's probably a bit of a, and I'm not going to use the word that often lies in that sentence given there are children in the room and one shouldn't be modelling bad language. But if we're truthful with ourselves, we've all, I think, at various points in our lives succumbed to these stereotypes. And that's because we still want to see women in the frame of nurturing and empathetic and caring. So if we see a woman who is commanding and leading, then it is fairly easy for us to conclude that she's not very likeable. I mean, the barriers we could talk about for a long time, but where are the change strategies? And once again, they're many and varied. But the mission we've set for ourselves at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is to make sure that our change strategies for having more women come through for leadership in all walks of life are evidence-based. What we know from the research that's available to date is that a lot of things people do to enable women to come through for leadership in their organisations are at best a net neutral, and some of them are counterproductive. That's because there hasn't been enough research and there hasn't been enough translation of good research into practice. And in a world where we've got absolutely so much to do, it breaks my heart that a minute of time or $1 of money gets wasted on something that's ineffective. We want to make sure that we are seeing maximum impact. We do know that if we go on the way we're going on now at current rates of change, the World Economic Forum has told us that we won't close the gap in political empowerment between men and women for 107 years, and we won't close the gap on economic empowerment for 202 years. Now, I think I'm making a reasonable job of eating my veggies and everything else, but I don't think I'm going to make 260. And so we really do need to quicken the rate of change if we're going to see a gender equal world in any of our lifetimes, including the lifetimes of the youngest people in this room. So that's what we're dedicated to at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. But at the end of the day, research findings are fantastic. Advocacy for research findings is even better. But what really makes change, and the history of feminism has taught us this, is waves and waves of women's activism when they join hands too with men who are prepared to support the cause. The big advances that we've made in societies like Canada and Australia and the United Kingdom, they didn't just fall out of the sky. They happened because women got out there and campaigned for change. And so the subject of our panel discussion tonight is absolutely on that, creating change with activism. Now, one of the things I like in my life post-politics is that I move from answering questions to asking them. I've spent many years with press packs pressing in around me, barking questions at me which demand immediate answers. So I've decided in this phase of my life that I quite like being the moderator. I haven't adopted the style of some of the worst of the questioners that I've had to face up to, and I certainly haven't adopted the style that is the order of the day for question time in Australian politics. So you are going to see a thoughtful and hopefully gentle, insightful discussion on creating change with activism. I'm joined by some fantastic colleagues as panellists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We might start at the end. Libby, I know that your voice is not as strong today as you would like, suffering an Ottawa cold, I think it is. But please, if you could introduce yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. My name's Libby Davies, and I am really sorry. I feel like I'm operating at about 50% of what I usually do, but I wanted to be here. So I'm a former Member of Parliament, 1997 to 2015, 18 years before the City Council. I'm talking a lot about this question of activism and women's leadership and what some of the issues are, so I'm very delighted to be here tonight, Julia and the other panelists. I think we're going to have a great discussion.
Hi, I'm Joy Masuhara, and I wish I could be just 50% of but I am reading this sign on the back of my name here that says you're making a difference right now. So I feel okay though. So, I'm a physician. I work in Vancouver. I'm also the co-chair of Women Transforming Cities, which is a nonprofit organization here working towards making cities better for women and girls. I sit on the board of Success. I have a hard time saying no, and I do a bunch of other things. But and I'd like to just thank Cecilia for her words at the opening.
I also wanted to thank my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be here with everybody today. I'm Laurel Weldon. I'm a professor at Simon Fraser University, professor of political science, and I'm a bit of a prodigal daughter. I've just returned to my home, Canada and British Columbia, after 25 years in the United States. So I'm quite happy to be back, and I'm very thrilled to be part of this panel. It's great to be home.
Cecilia.
Cecilia Point, other than my Heinz 57 ancestry, I'm the Director of Operations for Indigenous Tourism Canada, and we're having a huge conference here in Kelowna in November, inviting you all to come. And I became an activist by being called by my elders, and I've been out there ever since, so that's it. Thank you. And I want to really welcome you. It's our honor to have you.
Thank you very much. It's an honour to be here. And Cecilia, I'm going to start with you because it is such an important day. And when we talk about concepts, gender equality, women's leadership, even activism, I'm conscious that they've all got cultural contexts and meaning. What do those terms mean for you?
Well, most First Nations people often have no choice but to activism. My sister and I were sort of thrown out there when our grave site was, one of our ancestral grave sites was under threat from development, and nobody seemed to care that they were digging up bodies, so we went down there and stood for 200 days to protect it. So culturally, our elders asked us to go and do that. What was the other part of the question?
Talking about women's lead, what does women's leadership mean to
Well,
you?
we've always had women leaders in our community, and you know, that changed with colonization. They only wanted to speak to the men, and in fact, I'm just anecdotally, again, it was Sharon McIver that mentioned this in her research, that when the, you know, when contact happened on the East Coast and they came and met with the chiefs, they said, "Where are your women? How come there's only men here meeting with us?" How, you know, so it's not a new concept for us to have women in power. We've had 2 elected chiefs since Indian Affairs was imposed upon us. Yeah.
Terrific to get that insight. I do want to throw generally to the panel, so we might start Laurel and then move along and come back to Cecilia if she wants to add. Looking across your life experience, how do you think things have changed for women pursuing leadership? Something that's got better and perhaps something that's got worse, if you think there are things that have got worse?
Well, of course, there are more women leaders, so today we were at a workshop, a kind of research workshop on women in politics, thinking about, and one of the things that we were able to do in that workshop, my colleague was able to do it, I was mainly a spectator, was to look at, ask the question, what difference does women's leadership make? And one reason we were able to ask that is because we have women leaders, so you know, I think that that's an important advance to think about right now. And there have been, I think an important thing is while we retain a critical perspective, to still appreciate the progress that has been made, and that we can have a panel like this, and we can have former PMs of Australia, and you know, other kinds of advances like this, people on the panel who have served in politics. That's pretty exciting. I guess the thing that persists that's a little discouraging to me is the kind of the persistence of things that haven't changed. So it's important to celebrate those successes, but also to remember that we do continue to have work to do. And some of the things that you mentioned are things that I find discouraging, things about the persistence of biases. And you know, you kind of think, well, you know, really, people don't really think that still today. They're still not saying the same things. And it does seem like they still are. And some of the things you mentioned about stereotypical biases, male bias, and there's such good experimental evidence still today that you know, people basically preferring men basically for their menness, maleness, if you control it for other things. One of my colleagues at Purdue used to call it the penis bump in her teaching evaluations. But you know, they're basically,
I'd be careful if you're going to take that terminology with you.
But you know, that basically, if you hold everything else equal, there's a lot of bias towards maleness, and you know, towards kind of these privileged social categories, and that shows up over and over again. So I think that that's a continuing problem that we, still have to think of, and it's complicated, right? So it's not just one stereotype. There's all these diverse stereotypes. Sorting out what stereotypes and how they affect different people and how biases work. It's a very complicated story, and I think you're right that we actually do need good research as well to kind of figure out what's going on at, kind of, at that nuanced level.
Yeah, I agree, Laurel. You know, there has been change for sure, but you know, if we look at gender gaps all across the board, really, they're still there, and they really haven't moved significantly. And then if we look at diverse women and their lives and the barriers to leadership, both systemic, structural, individual. I mean, we all have our individual sort of barriers, and I think we still have a long way to go. If I think about myself, even growing up in Vancouver, I did not experience a lot of women, and particularly diverse women, in any kind of roles that made me believe that I could be, in those roles. And that's changed. That certainly has changed. We see way more, ethnic diversity in even just in social media and ads and everything else. So, but that all has an impact. but we're still being very bombarded all the time with those gender stereotypes. And we still have to do a lot to change those things.
Well, thank you. Well, obviously a lot has changed, and I recently had the opportunity to work with Dr. Jeanette Ash on an article that we both did together about women in politics, and we had this great discussion. We were looking at the numbers, and I think the year that I got elected, 77 women in Parliament, and when I left, it went up. It was 66, and it went up to about 72. And then the local election went up to 90, still far below the 30%. It's not only the numbers, of course, it's the environment that you're in. And we kind of pose the question and trying to answer it. If more women get there, what kind of environment are we operating in? And I have to say, when I first started running, 1976, I was a young woman, there were very few women in politics, there were very few progressive women. So most of the role models were men, and I think that's clearly changed, which is great because it had to change. But those old patriarchal systems of male-dominated politics, if you look at Parliament, it's still there. It's still very, very powerful. So I do think we have to answer a lot of questions and look at the barriers about what happens when we get there. How do we stay there? How do we stay strong? What kind of supports do we have, and what kind of challenges are we facing? And I think this is true for all women, but particularly for racialized women, for Indigenous women, trans women, women with disabilities. I think many white is still the glass ceiling, but I think we have to recognize that with the diversity, that there are incredible challenges still to be in the political arena if we want to be successful and not feel that we're being marginalized and sidelined.
Cecilia, do you want to comment on this? Okay. It's all right. I'm going to pull two threads out of the discussion so far. Laurel, you talked about what are still unconscious bias issues, stereotyping. And at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we've been enjoying a book. I'd have to say my colleague Rosie has been particularly enjoying it. But it's a book called Why Are We Still Promoting Incompetent Men? It's written by a man, by Dr. Thomas Chamorro at the UCL. And he explains that in his view, the main reason for the uneven sex leadership ratio is due to the inability of us to discern between confidence and competence. And so most selection procedures, obviously in politics, but even when you think about recruitments and promotions in business, whether you get the job is largely about how you present at the interview. That tends to be about bravado and self-claims about what you can or can't do. He compares that to actually really looking at the attributes of people who are the most successful managers and leaders, and finds that curiosity and between confidence and competence is so much. Is any of that ringing true? And if so, how do we change it? Yes.
I recently wrote a political memoir, and I actually wrote about this because being in Ottawa, it took me a while to figure this out, and I feel like for years I was sort of in denial about the sexism that took place. I was so busy working on things and doing things, and I always put it aside. But I went and spoke to a women's conference after a couple of years that I was there, and I started writing down the characteristics of what I thought, to me, so it was very personal list, was a good leadership versus leadership that turned me off. And if you don't mind, I just read a couple. On my good list was compassion and thoughtfulness, caring about people, taking a risk is okay, bring new people in, challenge stereotypes and biases, be straightforward, act in small ways that help people, know that you'll make mistakes and be okay with it, have confidence in yourself and those around you, see yourself as part of a team, And I felt that that really represented more a female style of leadership, not totally, but in a general way. And then on the other page, the not so great list, and I'm sure this will be familiar to you, Julia, I put down backroom deals, winning at any cost, false flattery, making promises that can't be delivered, making yourself and your actions always the center of attention, craving media so much it's almost an obsession, diminishing others to bolster your own ego, driven by the need for power, making it clear that there's an in and an out group, and the list goes on. But over the years it really struck me that we do have this idea about what success in leadership is, and it is so gendered. It is very gendered, and often women are not heard, we're not visible because we approach it in a very different way. And I hope today we can talk about what's going to change that. Like, how do we assert ourselves more strongly? How do we change those structures and barriers so that that kind of leadership model does begin to change? Because that's what's got to happen.
Well, and how do you think we change those barriers?
Well, I think critical mass is really important. I mean, definitely having more women, more diverse women in the room speaking their own experience, their own truth, is very critical to, it changes the dynamic. So when we're changing the political discourse, being heard, speaking out, sharing your experience, supporting one another, I think are very critical factors. So critical mass is very important. But I think the other thing that's very important is that political parties themselves have to examine how they operate and realize that it really, in many respects, is still the old boys club, right? And it's, wink, wink, nod, nod, I'm going to raise you some money, and we're going to do it this way, and it's all behind doors and closed doors. And often, we feel like we don't even know what the rules are. We've seen this play out in Ottawa recently, right? You break the rules, but you don't even know what they are because they're unwritten, right? They're seeped in this patriarchal history. So I think for political parties themselves to examine objectively how they operate, how they select candidates, how they support candidates, what happens if you lose, how do you nurture people? I think those questions will help change things, hopefully.
Thank you, thank you. Joy, incompetent men, and how do we get to a better analysis about what's good leadership?
Very easy question to answer. Just want to go to the idea of unconscious bias and implicit bias. There's this online test that one can do. Some people might know about it. It came out of Harvard, the implicit association test. And I thought, okay, well, I'll try this out, and it was around gender. So it was whether you associated males with science and females with humanities, and they test your conscious situation first, and of course I'm saying of course women can be scientists, etc. But I failed miserably when I actually did the unconscious the test, because they make you do it in a way where your conscious part is gone. So I think it just shows that there is so much, so many messages that we get at a very young age, and those are the ones that stick, because we know that from how our brains develop. That a lot of it is all hardwired in as an infant even, and we're just constantly bombarded with lots of messages saying that boys should be leaders and girls shouldn't be. And so I think we have to start really, really early on teaching different things to young boys and young girls, and changing this whole thing that gets stuck in your brain, because it takes so much more effort later when you're older to change that.
I think that's very wise, and if anybody's looking for further reading, there is a fantastic book by an Australian academic. You would expect me to get in a plug for Australia, called Cordelia Fine, who wrote a book called Delusions of Gender, where one of the things that she talks about is how people say that their young daughter's got a pink gene because she loves everything that's pink. and she reminds us that until the middle of last century, the protocol for the colour dressing of young children, at least in Commonwealth countries, so Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, was pink for boys and blue for girls, because pink was the colour of the Commonwealth. It was seen to be a near relative of red, which was the colour of valour, and blue was seen to be a dainty colour like Wedgwood china. So just goes to show how the stereotypes can get re-engineered and re-engineered pretty quickly if we try. We would try a much more productive re-engineering than that.
Oh yeah, the only thing I would add to that, the excellent conversation, is that there's actually some pretty interesting experimental evidence again about incompetent men. And it shows
They're experimenting on incompetent.
Experimental is the wrong word. So there is some experimental work on this, but it also is combined with large-scale studies of a couple places where there have been formal evaluations of competence, like in the military and in law, for example, where you have to write job evaluations for people. And one of the things they found in these evaluations was that essentially the different standards are applied to women, to women, to racialized men, and to white men. And in terms of incompetent men, so there's lots of interesting things in these studies, like that when people say give the glowing recommendations for women, they're really meaning that these glowing recommendations are like for a girl, for a woman, right? So you're really smart for a woman, right? So that when you actually look at what happens as a result of these evaluations, you think, why am I not doing better? I got this glowing evaluation, because you're not reading the implicit part. But the incompetent men part is that it's really hard for white men to mess up enough to get fired. So that actually the consequences for similar kinds of problems in these evaluations were quite dire for women or racialized minorities, women of color, but white men had a hard time getting themselves fired in these various, or getting penalized. That tended to be more forgiving. So they didn't also reward them, say as many nice things about them, like, oh, yeah, he's pretty good. But then also when they messed up, they were kind of like, oh yeah, we'll probably do okay, probably recover. So it was really hard to see the same kind of consequences because different standards are essentially being applied. But a lot of it is implicit. It's not necessarily even at the conscious level, it's an implicit standard that's different.
And how then do we change that?
Well, yeah, so, Joe.
Yeah,
okay.
We've had a couple of suggestions of change.
So that's a complicated question and lots of different steps to it. But one thing for sure is to get people to think about the standards they're applying, to foreground. So a lot of the power of norms, of these kinds of implicit assumptions, operate in the background. So as we are making assumptions about things and we're not scrutinizing them, they're not pulled into the foreground where we are aware of them. And of course, being aware of these biases is this implicit association test points out, and I encourage people to do it because actually it's pretty compelling, because I actually did the science test myself, and I did it again because I was like, oh, there's no way I'm biased against science. I did this again, and then I went through it again, and I still couldn't do that. You tried to do the same thing? No. See, I tried it again. I was like, now I know. Now I can definitely fight my own bias, but it's actually much harder than it sounds. So you know that it's there, and everybody knows this, right? It's not as easy to say, like, oh, I might just say that thing and kind of make it so. So there has to be a lot of work that goes into it. So one thing is to kind of just say, like, that's a starting point, but there's a lot of things to do. And one thing is you have to have something that you can do instead. So it has to be an easy practice or something that you can replace the biased practice with. So ways to make sure that you recognize bias, a biased activity or an undesirable activity, you have to have a good candidate for something else. Also, you have to be related. So one experimental study looked at women and men who were told about sexism and asked whether they changed their behavior. And women were more likely to change their behavior than men, even when you made both aware. So there's not, we want to be aware of ways that where we sit influences where we stand, or whatever. Think about how who we are affects our desire for change. And even when we're motivated, some of these things are going to be harder. So, I don't know if that's helpful.
Yes, no, that's very helpful. Cecilia, would you go to incompetent men?
Well, this is sort of why I gravitate back to my own community and stay inside the bubble, because I find whenever I do migrate out there, and I worked for a major airline for many years, and I found that when I had a male boss, they wanted a waiter. They just wanted someone to go get them stuff all the time. And when I had a woman boss, they were like, oh, you're too smart to be my secretary. You need to go to school. You need to do this. So I found that women were more like empowering and pushing me forward. I don't know why that was, because again, like I said, in my community, I had lots of great examples of women leaders as chiefs, as councillors, and I don't know if any of these city councillors have dealt with them. They're tough women, so so I really don't know how to change that. I mean, I'm working on it with my own children, they're teenagers, my son and my daughter, and it does trouble me. In fact, the way a lot of young boys are still look at women, like all women, just as sexual objects and nothing else. And there's really bad stuff on social media, on Instagram, anyway. So I don't know how to change it. I'm just trying to start the groundwork at home.
I'm going to come back to that social media point because I think that that's a really important one, but I'm going to move the focus now onto activism, so the core topic we're here to talk about tonight. And I'm going to ask each of you what you think the future is for activism around a feminist agenda here in Canada. What does that mean to you? What do we need to focus on? What are the strategies? And coming from the outside, many people would look at Canada and of course would note the very dire material that was in today's report. But people's image too of Canada is that it's a society that has taken seriously at the political level feminist ideas, that's had a gender equal cabinet, that it's got a prime minister who's prepared to call himself a feminist. There are countries not that far from here who would think all of that is beyond miraculous. How, against that backdrop, what is there? What is the work for activism, women's activism in Canada to do? So I'm happy to take it in any order. Whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump in first. And I think, unfortunately, it usually has to be a matter of life and death, and it has to affect someone very personally. Like I'm looking at Ontario, where all of the parents came out when funding for their autism was cut. For their kids with autism, and then they took to the streets, and I bet they never thought they'd be doing that. They never thought that. So, yes, with the dire information that came out today, I mean, that really only seems to affect us, and we are only 3 or 4% of the population. But that's why we are taking to the streets, and I think when people see us out there, like, yelling and drumming and everything, they don't realize that we have already used all the other tools in our toolbox before we got to the streets screaming. And why in the United States women are not burning down the White House right now, I don't know. But so because I don't know why, what is not spurring them to activism? What is it? Why are you just not, like, why are you just watching the Kardashians and doing nothing else? Like I'm quite frustrated.
A word from our sponsors, no one's actually talking about burning down the White House. That was a metaphor, a very
Well, I think your comment is making me think that one of the things I should have said at the beginning when Julia said, what are some of the things you're hopeful about? One of the things I should have said that makes me hopeful is the explosion of activism, because at the same time as it seems like nothing's happening, perhaps particularly as people from the north look to the south and wonder what the heck is going on, we see both in Canada and the United States unprecedented levels of activism. It's the biggest explosion of activism in decades, and a huge number of people who are active are people who have never been active before, women in particular. So there's actually, unfortunately, a lot of organized racists and other kinds of people who are coming to activism for the first time. But 2 to 1, the new activists are not. They're on the progressive side. 2 to 1 progressive to reactionary activists of these new people who are flooding into activism in the United States. So that's something to be happy about, and it's something that brings me some hope for the future. And I do think that as long as people can stay united, which I think is going to be a huge challenge for good reasons, lots of diversity in the people who oppose Trump in the United States. But as long as people can stay united, I do think that there's a great possibility for making more of this. Crisis is a terrible perhaps this is a terrible thing to waste, and we'll see some really important progressive successes come out of this, one can hope, as a result of this kind of upsurge in activism.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree that there is an upsurge. I can, sitting here going, okay, do I put my optimistic hat on or my cynical hat on? And